Well, good morning. Very good, fascinating set of discussions prior to this one. I wanted to talk to you a bit about this planning study, and before I do that, I want to say a couple things. One was I was going to apologize for a tie or just take it off, but then Eric wore one, so I was okay there. Yeah, twice a year. I appreciate it, Eric. And I think the other thing I want to do is throw out one more perspective of this year that Kevin and others have talked to you about in terms of the hydrologic implications of the year. Most of you might recall that last November, Lake Mead got to a point in its elevation that was its lowest point since it was first filling in the 1930s. And it made a lot of headlines. It actually was not that big an event, obviously, to us as water managers, but the implications of it might have been, and that was we were within about 7 feet of this trigger point, we call it, that the 2007 guidelines defined, where the first shortage to the lower basin states would have been imposed. And although we all know that the upper basin states have shortages every year based on just pure water availability, it's quite remarkable that the lower basin states, lower division states, have been able to have this 100% reliable system from day one. And so that might have been a more telling part of that story. After this year, at the end of this December, Lake Mead will have gained about 50 feet. So it'll end up from 1082, if you're familiar with the elevations, last November on the 17th, if I recall. On December 31st, we're projecting it'll be at 1133. So I think Eric said it best, there are 2002s still in our future. It could be next year, although we'll pin Kevin down at lunch here and see what he really thinks about that. But in any event, we have to be planning for this, and that's what the study is about. So let's see if I know how to do things here. That was the wrong button, clearly. Dave Kanzer, he's close, I'll bet, or someone that can help me here. All right, Eric, which button am I supposed to push here? Same button again. There we go. To advance, which way? Top button? Bottom button, thank you. Thanks, Kevin, appreciate it. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so to get started, let me say a couple things about this study. You saw a version of this graph from Mark just previously. Vertical axes are the volume in acre feet, millions of acre feet, and the horizontal axis is the last 100 years of recorded gauged history. And there's two lines, and I'm not going to have to define which is which. One is supply and one is water use over the past 100 years, and it's very clear to you, I know with your knowledge of the system, which is which. You know the variability, we just talked about it. That blue line jumps all over the place. And that red line, in some sense, have just continually come up and up. And that really is the issue at hand, is what do we do about that? Well, if you look in the 1977 time frame, and I know that'll be hard for you to see, but it's that big dip down in the blue line where it goes below the use. The red line is use, it's not demand. There were certainly demands in any of those years that were not met, particularly here in the upper basin, but that was the recorded, accounted for use in each year. So in that year, when supply was much less than use, we all know why it worked, and it worked because of this large amount of storage we have on this system. The ability to store over 4 times the average annual inflow is what has made this system quite viable and, in fact, 100% reliable to the lower basin over the last 100 years. So the question again is, what happens in the future? And so I will look at that next slide, but let me start it by saying this. If we rolled back the clock 50 years ago and we tried to think about what the changes were going to be on this system between then and today, I've just put a few on this table. And my goal here is to not go through in any detail, but to put us in that frame of mind that what we're really trying to do now is look forward 50 years from now. And we're trying to not just look at what the water supplies might be and what the water demands might be, but what might other changes occur on this system. And that's really what the study is trying to do. And we're doing that through a scenario based approach. And I think many of you in this room are familiar with that approach. And some of you have probably participated in using that kind of approach for your type of planning, but that's the approach we're looking for. So we're always trying to put ourselves again in this framework of we know where we are today, and we're trying to look out to 2060, and we know there'll be changes. There'll be changes in all of those areas, and particularly we've all been focused on the changes in the natural system. But I don't want us to forget the potential changes in those other areas. So let me jump to the slide again, and this is essentially the slide Mark just showed. So all we've done is taken the previous slide and we have done a smoother on it, so your eye can more clearly see those trends. And those big blips, you know, we all know in the 20s when the compact was negotiated, we certainly thought there was more water in the system than it appears there has been in the last 100 years. And the other big blip there is the 1980s. I would also venture to say there are 1983s in our future, but maybe not as many. Well, we only had one in the last 100 years. So is there one in the next 100 years? Is there one in the next 10 years? Frankly, we have no idea. But the point, again, is we've got to look at all these broad possible futures in order to figure out what is the problem, the magnitude of the problem that confronts us in terms of the sustainability of this system. Okay, so what's this study? As a part of the Reclamation's Water Smart program, if you've heard of that, and quite frankly, I mean this in a positive way, but when the administration changes, we typically package up programs we have, we may rename them, and we'll add some more. And so the basin studies were a concept that really came prior to the administration change, but because our commissioner was so involved in the drafting of the Secure Water Act, which gave us clear authority to do these kinds of proactive studies, particularly with regard to climate change, potential climate change impacts throughout all of the reclamation basins, the basin study program became an integral part of what's now called Water Smart. So what is it? It's really to look at long-term issues in all the reclamation basins, and in particular the Colorado River Basin is this study, and to assess what the future supplies and demands might be, look at the risk to the resources, and more importantly, develop and evaluate options that we should be talking about now to be considered to ensure the sustainability of the system. Now we're looking 50 years out on this system. So 50 years out through 2060, we're trying to look at what those scenarios might be of the futures and to develop and evaluate what possible options we should be considering. The study will result in no decisions. It's truly just a planning study, a very important one in my opinion, but we won't come out with any decision to build something or to do anything. But what we do believe we'll come out with is a firm technical foundation that defines the range and magnitude of the problem that's facing us on this system, as well as a portfolio or set of portfolios of options we should be considering. And that's really the key to the study. So we began it last year. It's due to finish next July. Quite frankly, we're pushing really hard here because we don't want to get caught up in election year politics, to be quite blunt. And we think the value of the study is such that it needs to come out. It will have real limitations to it. Let me throw out a couple. One is groundwater. We are not including the surface groundwater interactions in the study. Quite frankly, we don't have the time or money to do it. But that's okay. I often say that if you take a small step in the right direction, it's a step worth taking. And I think this study is a good example of that. We know we have a problem on the system in terms of its long-term sustainability. That is undeniable. And so the worst thing for us to do is to do nothing. And so this study, again, its goal is to form that firm and solid technical foundation from which to discuss what to do. I've listed a couple of addresses for you there. I won't go through that with you. I know these slides will be made available. If you've not contacted us, feel free to, and you can contact me personally as well. So the study area, let me say a brief thing or two about the area we're looking at. it is basin-wide. This is somewhat of a unique study because it is a basin-wide look at the problems and a basin-wide look at what the possible solutions might be. And so that is a unique thing, and that's what's shown on the right-hand side with the outline of the hydrologic basin. You may be able to see in the back, I'm not sure, but there's some other areas hatched in outside the basin, which of course are areas that currently receive Colorado River water, and we must obviously include the future demands and potential supplies in those areas as well, because they affect what will be drawn or needed to be drawn from the Colorado River. The caveat here on the study area. It's been talked about many times already, the Gila Basin. The Gila River Basin, that big area over there in Arizona, and I don't know that the pointer I can make it work, but anyway, we all know where it is. This study ignores it. Now, there's lots of fodder for, again, putting your grandkids through law school, perhaps, in just the Gila River Basin, as we just talked about briefly. But from a very practical standpoint, let me explain what's going on in our approach. And we've had this approach for the last 20-plus years in terms of our long-term planning studies. Essentially, the water that's generated in the Gila River Basin naturally is consumed in the Gila River Basin. That's the bottom line. So if you're trying to look basin-wide from a big water budget perspective, very seldom, like once every 10 years, does any water hit the main stem down below all of our dams near Yuma, Arizona. That's where the Gila dumps in. 1 out of every 10 years we get some flow. Those flows are typically very large. We can't manage them very well in terms of allowing them to go toward the treaty delivery requirement to Mexico, so they get access to Mexico. So from a purely practical standpoint, this study, as well as all of our planning studies in the recent past, last 20 or so years, ignores the Gila. The last thing I'd say here is this is a cost-shared study. Most of our government type of things now are 50-50 cost shares, as you all know, and with limited federal budgets that are going to continue to come at us, this will absolutely be our way of doing business, in my opinion. So our 50-50 cost share partners are the 7 basin states. I list the organizations that actually signed our agreement, but many, many other folks are involved within these states in terms of this cost share. You are obviously welcome to be involved as well, and I think your representative here from our perspective is Ted, and many of you know Ted Kowalski from the board, probably all of you do, so feel free to contact him as well. Okay, here's some options for participation that I have come up with, and I try to point out to folks, and let me just get those off the table right now, so if you can mull them around, you want to talk about them to me or Ted, you can. But, you know, we have a website, the usual stuff. We do webinars, and I know that's a technology that most people are quite familiar with that seems to work well. I think the other thing is you can review and comment on products. That's certainly we invite that. We'll come and give you periodic updates to your individual organizations if you'd like them. They can be somewhat formal, informal, whatever works. If you want to establish points of contact with what we call the study team, that's the folks that are really doing the work here. You can do that. And then we can interact at a more technical level with those folks. And if you really want to roll your sleeves up, you can join one of our working groups. There's many other ways to participate, but we would really value and invite your input. Okay, so phases of a study. Remember, we have 3 things we're trying to get at, is assess the future water supply and water demands that are likely to occur on this system. We want to look at what the reliability of the system is going to be to meet the needs of the resources. And by resources, I mean water deliveries for consumptive use, ag, M&I, water for the environment, water that generates hydropower, all of the resources we're looking at here that we can. And then finally develop these options and strategies. And that's what the 4 bars across show, each of those phases, starting from the water supply assessment. And the green now shows essentially what's been done and was published in this interim report we put out. And the white boxes are what we're working on now and we'll be working on between now and July. Okay, so we've essentially assessed the future water supplies. I want to talk a little bit about that. We framed up what we think are scenarios for the water demand, and we're currently quantifying those. I'll talk a little bit about that and then hit on a couple other things here. Okay, an interim report. So this is a dynamic process, and in our early views, we thought, well, we'd just finish each of those 4 phases, put out a report, peer review it, take public comment, and move forward. But it moves much faster than that. So we have this concept of interim reports. They're snapshots in time. They allow you to see where we're at. You can comment on them. The report's available. You can call us. We'll send you one as well, but it's available on the website. You're welcome to comment at any time on it. We had asked for comments back in July, but don't worry about that. Whenever you get them, you send them to us. We'll do our best to include any comments anyone has on it. So that's really what interim reports are, and we'll continue in this fashion. And so let's talk about the water supply scenario. So 4 scenarios we've defined in that interim report and done quite a bit of detailed analysis about them. So each of these scenarios generates a suite of realizations. So out of these 4 scenarios, there's about 2,000 possible water supply futures that we're looking at, just to try to frame it in terms of the magnitude of the amount of data we're trying to deal with. So I've got 3 little pictures there to help me explain those 4 scenarios. One is observed resample. We've used this one for years, and we really, frankly, thought about not even including it. But we're so used to looking at it, all of us, that we've kept it in here. And the idea is that 100-year record that's in the inset there to the right, that we're assuming that the hydrologic variability captured in that record is indicative of the next 50 years. How many of you would think that's a good assumption? Yeah, we should throw it out. But in any event, it's kept for purposes of comparison because, again, so many of our planning studies have viewed it this way in the past. We decided to keep it. Down below that inset is our paleo record for the last 1,250 years, and that record really shows quite a bit of variability that's not captured in the 100-year record, and particularly that big dip you'll see, about a third of the way over. That drought in the 1100s has been termed the mega drought. Certainly is a drought that is not anywhere close to what the 100-year record shows. So that's what, by sampling that's a scenario and includes much greater variability. There's a way to combine the historical and paleo record to combat some of the issues that folks say are a negative to the paleo. It doesn't capture the extremes. That's a third one. And the final one is downscaled climate change model projections. And so all 4 of those scenarios are what will be used in the study. We are not trying to assign likelihoods to any of those scenarios, nor to the realizations from those scenarios. It really is a matter of trying to look at the broad range of the futures so that we can define the magnitude of the problem. Okay, this one I'm going to quickly hit on just to show you the variability, and it's already been talked about a little. On the far left is this is just analyzing the means from these realizations of the 4 scenarios. So there's 4 blocks from the left, starting as the historical record, over to the right is the climate change projections, and what we're showing is the average annual inflow into the system, as well as the range that these realizations give you. So the range is captured by the little box. That's the interquartile range, as well as the long skinny lines are the min and maxes. And Mark mentioned this earlier, that on the far right, that's the climate change projection. So a decrease in the average annual is shown by the point in the middle of the box, and then the range we can see. So a lot of variability that is projected by those models. And quite frankly, it's difficult to sort out how much variability is due to just the models themselves versus what we really think is going to happen in the natural system. We've used 16 different climate change models to generate all those realizations to try to combat that uncertainty just due to the models. Then the dotted lines the last 20 years, essentially, to kind of show you how each of the scenarios would capture even what happened the last 20 years, let alone in the future. So that's, I think, a bit of interest. Okay. How about uses? Well, again, we're quantifying these now. This is just a plot of historic use over the last 40 years roughly, throughout the basin, color-coded by the category. So the yellow obviously is agriculture, and it still remains the largest use in the basin, as we all know, 70–80% or so of the total basin use. And so we've sliced and diced a lot of the historical data, and now the key is to project that next 50 years for the demand scenarios and do it even by category. So here are the demand scenarios we've come up with. And I won't bore you with all of the details, but the bottom line here is we looked at what we thought were the driving forces of uncertainty and demand. Things like demographics, land use, technological changes, economics, etc., and boiled it down to parameters like population, efficiency of M&I use, agricultural land use, efficiency of the ag land, etc. And we've tried to couch all of these descriptions of the scenarios in terms of those parameters. And now the key is to say, well, what will be the trend in those parameters over time under each of those future scenarios? So clearly at the bottom, the more greening of society scenario, as we've just informally called it, makes assumptions that there would be increased demand for the ecological health of the system. Now those are typically non-consumptive use demands, that is flows in the river, etc., but still could overall affect the availability of water for the other resources, for instance. So the idea is to couch these in terms of a narrative. We've done that. That's in the interim report, and now we're out defining what the numbers mean. And again, they're just projections. So what do we believe will happen to population in southern Nevada over the next 50 years? It changes depending on which of those scenarios we're trying to describe. Okay. All right. One more thing about how we're going to try to analyze and quantify the impacts to the resources. We call them metrics. We have a model, and I won't bore you with any details of modeling here, other than it's pretty germane stuff, really, lots of work, but pretty straightforward. So the idea really is that we want to be able to run all the scenarios and try to quantify what the impact to resources will be. A particular water delivery in the system, a particular lake level for recreation, particular flows for recreation, and or the healthy ecosystem, ESA, etc. So that's what metrics are about. And they're nearly finished, still working on the ecological side, because it's very difficult, and this is one of the study limitations that I want to remind you. It's very difficult to really see the spatial and temporal details sometimes we need to quantify the impact to a resource. This model runs on a monthly time step. That's about what the technology allows right now, and it's got a certain limit to its spatial resolution. So there'll be limitations like this that'll be very clearly defined in the writing of the report, but honestly will require additional study down the road. Okay, so let me talk about where we're at and take a few questions here. So here's that same phase diagram, the 4 phases across the top of assessing supply, assessing demand, doing this reliability analysis I just described with a model using metrics, and finally phase 4, which is developing and evaluating the options and strategies that we should be considering. So that's what we're working on now. So before I leave that, let me talk just briefly about that 3rd phase over the system reliability. I just mentioned it a bit, but there's great uncertainty here in terms of the policy. We just talked about it this morning, about the non-deplete compact obligation. The question is, how do we model that into the future? That's very difficult. It's got great policy implications, and so I just don't want to leave you to think that the only uncertainty in this process is due to the natural uncertainty and or the of supply or the uncertainty of how people move around and use water in terms of demand. I mean, there's great uncertainty in terms of the policy implications. So we've got some ways to work around this, but I just don't want, again, to not point this out to you, that there are lots of discussions and ways of thinking about how to get through this in a modeling perspective. And so won't bore you with details again. We can talk on the side about that. And I already mentioned about the temporal and spatial detail that's available to us. The last thing I'd mention is the amount of data. 2,000 scenario realizations on supply, plus all the options, because we want to try to run a suite of options to see how they improve the impact or mitigate the impact of the resources. So there's an enormous amount of data here. We've been working with the RAND Corporation and some other folks on the side trying to come up with good ways of distilling that information so it will make sense to folks, so that you can really look at it and really make some judgments about what we ought to be doing in the future. So anyway, lots going on there, and I won't bore you anymore with that. So let's concentrate on the fourth phase, and that's the development of the options and strategies. Okay? So here's what I'll just take one slide here and let me work through the picture. So what I have on that little picture is, again, some piece of history in terms of two curves, supply and demand. And now I'll bet you can guess which is which based on this climate change scenario, and that's the one I happen to plot here. So I'm just plotting the average water supply in the future over the next 50 years coming out of those climate change models. That's the blue curve. That's declining over time. And then the red curve is a postulated demand. So it's increasing, right? And so the difference in the two is the gap. It's the imbalance in the supply and the demand. Now, again, the model will run through all of these scenarios and not just look at gaps, but look at the effect that storage can have in terms of mitigating the imbalance, et cetera. So there's lots of detail here. This concept, though, for you is to see what options and strategies are trying to do. We're trying to fill the gap. So we can do two things. We can work on the supply side, and we can work on the demand side. We can certainly work some on that. Can we optimize a bit better, as Eric has pointed out? And we will look at that. I'm sure there'll be some options that get submitted about that, and we'll certainly look at it. But really, in terms of this picture and in terms of these kinds of gaps that are likely to be shown, it's probably optimization will fill that gap. And so these little pies are showing portfolios. So let me explain what we think the concept of a portfolio is. We are going to have an open public process here, and you're invited. We've been using webinars a lot. We'll likely kick this off next month via a webinar. And we invite your ideas of options. What should we be looking at? And then we'll take all of those options, and we believe we'll get literally 100 or more, and we'll try to categorize them, and we'll categorize them perhaps in terms of what the option's about. Is it on the water supply or demand side? If it's supply, is it, for instance, ocean desal? Then we might have several ideas about ocean desal. That's a category to put options in. Similarly, on the demand side, we might have categories like conservation. We've talked much about that. Lease arrangements, water transfers, water banks, all of those kinds of things. We'll see if we can come up with representative options that represent those kinds of categories that we've heard about. We'll run those through the model. We'll decide how well they mitigate the impact to resources, both temporally, which this shows very clearly, but also spatially, which this graph doesn't show. There's another axis here, and that's where does the water end up. And that way we could, by determining that, or at least postulating that, we can try to, again, analyze the impact of the resources. So the little pies there are the sets of those options. So maybe as we go out in time, if we will definitely see in some scenarios this exact outcome of the balance is growing and growing. So maybe there are different portfolios based on time, and those portfolios might have other ideas behind them, like let's try in the near term to do the lowest cost. Let's do the low-hanging fruit, what people call the no regrets options. It doesn't cost too much, it generates real water. Why would we not do it? When we get to 2030, if the climate isn't what that is projected by that blue line, we wouldn't have any regrets that we did those things. Certainly wise use and better use of water in terms of a conservative approach is probably one of those. So those are the kinds of ideas that we want you to give us. We will do all the hard work to analyze them, put them back out, have dialogue about them with the idea that the final report then would come up with a set of portfolios that we believe would be robust no matter what the future ends up being, but also would be things that we could then start real dialogue on in terms of trying to implement. Mark said it, many others have said it, we don't want to wait. We've got time, but we don't want to wait. We don't want to wait till 2030 to see that really the average inflow has been going down by 9%, and we're in trouble. And so the time is now. And we really value your input in helping us frame these last few months of the study, and particularly with regard to what these options and strategies should be that we should be looking at. This is a timeline. I won't hit on it too much. We'll leave it again for you. The key things are, again, that if you would like input or give us input on where we are currently in regard to these scenarios, feel free to. We'll kick off the options and strategies phase next month. We really invite you to join us in that process. We'll have a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of this model running to try to get the reliability figured out and quantified. But come April, June, we'll be trying to put these portfolios together, and there'll be a lot of interaction to the stakeholder community at that time as well. So please keep those ideas in mind and those times. And with that, I think I will conclude, and I appreciate your interest.